This video will go over the parts of the plot and help you understand it better. And by the end of the video, you will have reviewed and know the different parts of plot, written some definitions, and completed a practice plot map. So stop when you see and take notes when you see the pencil. Use the rule of 5 and pause as often as you need to, but especially when the pause button comes up. So plot is the map of a story from start to finish. It's the structure as well as the events of the story. Not just any series of events is actually going to be a plot. Take a minute and get that written down in your notes. So something to remember, so you can have a whole bunch of things that happened, but doesn't make it a story with a plot. Think of, for example, of the way a house is built. You start out with a bunch of wood and other things, and you slowly start putting that together until you create a home. But unless each board is in the right place, doing the right thing, it's not going to be a very good place to live. Same thing with a story. You can have a whole bunch of events, but unless they're organized in the right way, doing their right job, it's not going to be a good story. So what are the different parts of plot? We're going to start out with exposition is the first one. Exposition provides the background information that you need to really understand the story. If you think about when you or a friend has started watching a movie like 20 minutes into the movie, so you missed the first part, and everybody's wishing that you would go away because you keep asking questions because you don't know what's going on. That's because you missed the exposition. Pause and write down the definition for exposition. In the exposition, we're going to learn about the situation, what was kind of going on before the action really gets started. It's going to give you the characters. It's almost always going to give you the protagonist. Antagonist sometimes comes a little bit later, but the protagonist is the main character, and the antagonist is the person or force that's working against the protagonist. And the setting, when and where the story is taking place. Think place and time. Pause and get those things written down. We're going to be looking at the Mrs. Teacher example. Anytime you see this screen, you're going to be going down to the second page of your notes and writing in on the plot line what comes up on the screen. So we're going to start with number 1, exposition. In our little example story, we have a very busy teacher. She lives, her name is Mrs. Teacher. She lives in Hillsboro, and this is taking place in present day early in the morning. So that's all the information you need to know before the story really gets started. Pause and get that written down in your plot line. Okay, going back up to the first page of the notes, we're going to next talk about the inciting incident. The inciting incident is an event that sets the rest of the story in motion. It kind of gets the rising action started and creates the conflict. It itself is not the conflict, but it certainly creates it. Pause and get those things written down. So in our Mrs. Teacher example, and again this is the second page, the inciting incident, the event that kind of gets everything started, is that Mrs. Teacher's alarm doesn't go off. That doesn't have to be a problem because, well, if it's Saturday, that's actually a good thing. Then she can sleep in. So the inciting incident is just an event, and it may not necessarily, doesn't have to be a problem. Pause and get that written down. All right, back up in our notes. Conflict. Conflict is the third and one of the most important parts of plot. It is the problem or struggle that's between the two forces in the story, and without conflict, there simply is no plot. You cannot have a good story without some sort of a problem involved. Now, there are different kinds of conflict. Sometimes you get human versus human, where you have two people or two groups of people kind of going at each other. You have human versus nature, where the people are dealing with some sort of catastrophic event, like an earthquake or a hurricane. You can have human versus society, where people are fighting against things that society is trying to make them do, or ways that society is trying to make them feel. And finally, you have human versus self. This is when we become our own worst enemy, and it's our own decisions and our own insecurities and our own fears that actually cause the problem, and not anything else. Pause and get those written down. Okay, down in our plot line. So if the alarm not going off is not actually the conflict, what is the conflict? Well, the conflict for Mrs. Teacher is that she ends up waking up late and has to figure out how to get to school on time. So that's the problem. And the rest of our little story here is going to be all about her trying to get to school on time. Pause and get that written down on your plotline. All right, now we get to the rising action. The rising action is the series of events that build tension and lead to the climax. Notice that it's a series of events. It's a whole bunch of things that happen. It's probably like 50 to 70% of the story. There's always going to be multiple events in the rising action, and each one helps to add tension or suspense or intrigue or interest as the story builds towards the climax. All the rising action comes because the conflict exists. Without the conflict, you would have no rising action. And this is where the author really hooks the reader, really gets interested into this part of the story, because it's really what the story is all about. Pause and get that written down. All right, so our dear Mrs. Teacher, what rising action events does she experience because she's running late, or as she is trying to figure out how to get to school on time? Well, first she gets out of bed and directly steps in a cat hairball. Oh, gross. Then as she continues to get ready, when she goes to dry her hair dryer breaks. Now what is she going to do? Then as she's trying to get something quickly to eat, the toaster burns the breakfast toast. So not only is she late, she has to go to school hungry. Undaunted, she jumps in the car, only to realize that it's almost out of gas. Can she even make it there? And then while she's driving, in addition to being hungry and worried about the gas and worried that she's going to be late for her students, she has to stop at every red light. Pause and get those written down. All of those actions, all those events really help build the tension for Mrs. Teacher. Finally, we get to the climax. Well, not finally, but next we get to the climax. And the climax is a turning point, something that happens or a realization that a character has that changes the direction of the story. It's a point of no return. And after this, the way the story is going to end is pretty much set. You cannot go back to the way things were in the past. Pause and get that written down. So, what is the climax for poor Mrs. Teacher? Well, while she is driving, gets a text from Mr. Principal, who tells her there's a 2-hour delay. Now, if anything's going to change the course of the story, this is going to, because all of a sudden she goes from being worried and late and crazy to not being late at all. It totally changes the way the story ends. It's a turning point in the story. Pause and get that written down. All right, back in our notes, the falling action. Falling action is pretty much anything that happens after the climax. The conflicts start to get resolved, the problems are ending, and we just know that the story is wrapping up. Every once in a while, you get a little bit of a twist or an extra little event in the falling action, but the main events are over. Pause and get that written down. So what is our falling action for Mrs. Teacher? Well, she has time, and so she stops to get gas and a donut because, my heavens, that was an exhausting, suspenseful morning that she just had. Pause and get that written down. Then we get to the resolution, the ending of the story. Here, the protagonist has either solved the conflict or the problem has been solved for him or her. And while there isn't necessarily an event with the resolution, the problem simply no longer exists for whatever reason. Pause and get this written down. So for our dear Mrs. Teacher, her resolution is that she can get to school with plenty of time to set up for her fabulous students. And so that conflict of trying to figure out how to get there on time simply no longer exists, and she's got plenty of time to relax and get things ready. Pause and get that written in your notes, in your plotline. All right, you've finished watching. So the last steps would be to go back and fill in any notes that you still need to. Feel free to rewatch the video as often as you need to. And then write your summary by answering the 2 hot questions at the very last part of your notes.